Hello everyone. So welcome to this webcast. Today we'll be talking about generating diagrams from your code. I will be presenting this brand new set of tools. And actually the goal is not only to present, but also get some feedbacks about the tools and the diagram that we generate. So if you see additional types of diagrams or improvement, please let us know. We'd be glad to go in the right direction to make it as productive as possible for everyone. So first of all, we will see the different kind of diagram that we can already generate to visualize the design of your application or document the structure and the inner working of the application. We will also see how to drill down from the diagram, which is quite of a high level representation of your application, down to object and code level, for instance, to prepare some modifications in the application. Then we will see how to edit diagrams to adjust their content if needed, how to share them between team members, print them, etc. Basically, the whole life cycle of the diagram. There are tools and editors for that. And finally, we'll see how to get started in case you wish to try this set of tools with your code. Okay, so now let's see how this works. How to generate and share your diagram. So basically, these tools are part of the Visual Expert toolbox. So it always starts with a static analysis of your code, where the code parser will read and understand the grammar of your code for different languages. They will extract a description of the code in a repository managed by Visual Expert, and then they will leverage this description to generate diagrams. So I would call that active diagram because it's not only something static that you can view, but you can also manipulate. If you click, you will be synchronized with the code. You can highlight dependencies. So there's a number of features that we will see together. The diagram is quite active and there are embedded features inside. We'll also have the possibility to export the diagrams in different formats. We'll discuss this later. This can happen on a single machine, especially if you wish to try this feature with your code for the first time. But if you have a large volume of code or if you're working as a team, then it's much better to install a copy on the server to analyze the code. You can even, and that's recommended, schedule the code analysis every day. For example, if you have a continuous integration process, you can do that every day at night. Then in the morning, everybody can access the repository to use the feature and in particular generate the diagrams that they wish. That will be done on a fresh copy of the code. Beyond diagrams, because it's based on Visual Expert, just to recap for those of you who never tried it already, Visual Expert provides more than 200 different tools in different categories. Number one, that would be the impact analysis tools to explore dependencies, generate metrics to see where the data are accessed from which programs, etc., and in general avoid regression bugs. You can generate some documentation to understand existing code. It could be the HTML documentation that we generate to document the source code, but that's also the case of the diagram that we discussed today on data model that are part of the diagram. You can compare two versions of your code. You can review the code to improve the maintainability and check development rules. And you can review the performance of your database code to identify the slow procedures and improve the response time of your application. Okay, now let's see some examples. So I will switch to Visual Expert. So this is the UI of the tool. So here you would see the application at object or component level with the dependencies between each component. So this is an example of a library uh, window. In this window, you can find event. Now, if you select an item here, you would see the source code of this item on the right. And on the left, you have what we call the navigation bar. It's actually a set of features to explore your code or ask questions about the code. And this list depends on the nature of the item selected here. So for an event, you would see this. For a window, it's another list. A library, a PBL, another list of feature, etc., etc. Here you have the list of tables of your application. Okay, good. So by the way, let's start our first example right here. This is the list of tables found during the code analysis. I also see the list of columns behind the table that we found during the analysis. Our first example would consist in generating a diagram to see all the dependencies to this column. So for information, we're using here an application that is composed of Powerbuilder code and Oracle database and Oracle procedures. Could be a SQL Server database and procedures set as well, but in that case, it's PB plus Oracle. The first diagram would see some kind of impact analysis for this particular column in case we change the column, for example. So I would go in this tab page for now, and I can generate this first example of diagram. And then we see that the result, this diagram is presented in forms of entities or blocks embedded one into each other. And in particular, we have two big blocks. The first one is the Powerbuilder application. The second one is the Oracle database right here. So the PB application includes a PBL, which itself, you see, includes some object with references to the column ID of the table sales order item that we selected before. And the same goes for the database. It includes, for example, a package, a table, a view, another package, etc. All of them referencing the same column. So first we have this diagram, but I mentioned that it would be more of an active diagram or dynamic diagram, if you like, because it's not only a graphical representation, but if you select something, so if I select, for example, this retrieve SQL inside this data window and PBL that is referencing the column, if I click here, I would see the code of the SQL with the references to the column that we selected before. And it would be the same on the size of the database. If I select the package, I would see the code of the package with the reference, and inside the package, I would see the procedure right here. Inside the procedure, I can focus on the SQL statement, still viewing the reference. The same goes for the view. For another procedure, that's the SQL reference, including the references, etc. Okay, so this kind of dynamic diagram on one hand is synchronized, as you can see, between the object level and the code level in case you need to drill down, as we mentioned before, for modification purposes of your application. But also, it's quite frequent that a diagram includes a lot of entities with dependencies in every direction. And then it's not so easy to understand exactly if you select one item, which other entities are connected to this item. So what we did is we basically highlight, if I select this, we do highlight in the diagram all the items that are directly connected to the item selected. So you see that in that case, those are the place where you can find directly the references to the column. And it's going to be the same with the other example of diagram that we will see later on. Okay. Now for the second example, we will focus on the data. It's just for us, this additional diagram is very young. It's just a beta phase, so it's not complete yet. But soon it's going to represent the data model, or at least a part of the data model based on the table you selected. So actually, I can go back to the same table that we saw before. And, I have this for now early stage of a data model, but you can already see that this table includes two columns that are actually foreign keys, and they are connected to these other two tables, and the primary key is here. And as we saw before, there's a synchronization If I select this, I would see, sorry, the definition of this table. The same goes for this other table product. And if I select this item, I can see exactly which other item in the graph are directly connected to it. The same goes for this one. So it's, like I said, it's just the beginning, and of course we will add more details. There's going to be the additional columns and other representation details that you traditionally see in a data model. But you can already give it a try, give us your feedback, and in the coming weeks it's going to be improved and completed. Okay, so that's for the second example. And the third example is going to be a bit different. This time it's no longer related to data, it's only object dependencies. And this diagram will be some kind of a high-level representation of the dependencies between the PBLs of your application. So the typical example is if you want to separate two subsets of your application. So you've been modifying the code so that the set of PBL number one is no longer calling the second set of PBLs, and you want to double check this. So you would, for example, select one PBL, and you want to make sure that this PBL is no longer related to either anything else, or at least the set of PBL that you want to separate. So you can just go here to generate this specific diagram that is called a PBL dependency diagram. And it's basically a chain of calls, but instead of a chain of call at object level, it's a chain of calls at PBL level. So it means that if I select this one, this PBL includes some object, and at least one object is including at least one call to this PBL, and also to this one and this one. And just like that, you can select any of those PBL and check where they are related. So this one is connected to three other libraries like this. Now, if you're wondering, yeah, okay, fine at a high level, but I need to know more. Tell me more. In particular, I would like to know which object exactly are calling something outside of the PBL. Then you would use another tool in this list. And this tool is called external references. So it will show you the reference outside of the PBL. If I click on this, it will draw up a list. So in this list, you see that this PBL includes this user object. And actually, this user object includes a number of calls outside of the PBL. So anytime something is called, you have the name of the PBL containing this something called. So there's here a number of functions called outside of the PBL, user object, attributes, etc. And that's the object number two in our PBL, calling as well a number of items outside of the PBL. So you can review one by one these calls. And if you want to go even deeper and drill down to the code, that's quite simple. You just look at the code and you select one item. So for example, this PBL includes this object, and this object is supposed to call this function in another PBL. If I click here, I would see where this call is located. So you see in my user object, there is an event called property syntax. And in this event, in line 51, this is where I have the call to this function outside of the PBL. And it goes on like that. You can see all the time you need, anytime you need, where is located a particular reference to something outside of the PBL. And you can edit. Basically you just go here and open this piece of code in the Powerbuilder IDE, and then you would refresh the analysis and generate again the same diagram. And this time you will double check that now it's looking good and you no longer have the dependencies between PBLs that you're not supposed to have. Okay? Okay, that's it for our third example. Now let's go back to the presentation. And we'll take a look at the life cycle. Um, there are actually three ways to manage the life cycle of a diagram, and I mean by that, generate the diagram, edit if needed, share it with your colleague, print, etc., etc. You have three options to do that. Uh, it always starts, obviously, by generating the diagram as we saw with Visual Expert, because we need the description of the code that we found during the code analysis. But once we generate the diagram, the first possibility is to save this diagram in the same repository where the Visual Expert project is defined. And that's an easy way to share it with all of your colleagues that are using Visual Expert. And there's a number of characteristics if you do that. So number one, what you get and what you share is the same active diagram that we discussed before, with the synchronization, with the source code, with the dependencies highlighted between entities in the graph, etc. This is editable. I will show you how to edit this diagram. But it's not meant to be printed or embedded in documentation, for example. That's another solution to do that. But for that, obviously, because you're using Visual Expert, you do need a license. And by the way, every people attending the seminar can get a free copy of Visual Expert to give it a try on your code. We will send you after the webcast the link to download, and just request a key and you get a free key to give it a try. The option number two would consist from Visual Expert to generate an XML file with a specific format that we defined. But this is going to be more of a static diagram because you no longer have the synchronization with the code or the highlight of the dependencies, but it's still editable with a dedicated editor that I will show you. It's still not meant to be printed or embedded in the code, but that's free to if you wish to deploy this type of XML file and edit them. And the third possibility would consist in a simply generated PNG file, an image. That's simply an image that you put on your network, and anybody can access this particular model or diagram. So obviously, it's no longer editable unless you use an image editor, but that's not the point. But then you can print, embed, do whatever you want, and of course, this is free of charge if you wish to deploy it. Okay, let's see how this works. So I'm coming back to Visual Expert. If I generate again the same diagram that we saw before, so let's take the example of this small data model here. I can, as you can see here, I have two options. Number one, I can export this. That's going to be simply an image. That's option number three. You do that on the network, and then you have a collection of diagrams that anybody can view, share, send, email, print, whatever. But here you have another button to edit the diagram, and that will open an editor that is provided with Visual Expert. And this is a typical editor, as you would see in Visio or any other diagram editor, where you can, change the text, add other items, change the connector, change the color, the font, the image. You can pretty much do anything on this diagram. And if you just close the editor, the saves are taken back to Visual Expert. So in the first scenario we mentioned, we will save this diagram after, or even without editing the diagram or after editing the diagram, we will save it. It is already now in the project, but if needed, I can, detach this diagram in a separate tab page. We call that a view. I can even rename this view if I want to give it a clear name, diagram about something, so that your colleagues understand what this diagram is about, and you will share this view with anyone who can access your Visual Expert project, and then you can comment, put some additional description and save. So anybody who's sharing the same project than you, let me refresh and go from start. So anybody who would share the same project, then you can load this view, That's the one we just saved right now. And he gets the same, diagram that you created before. And again, it's dynamic. You see the dependencies, you have the synchronization with the code. So all the advanced features to make it an active diagram are preserved because it's still connected to your code analysis and to the Visual Expert project. Now, if you want to go for option number 2 and make it an XML file outside of Visual Expert, it would start the same. You would edit right here, and instead of after you change whatever you want to change, of course, it's a bit ugly what I'm doing, but anyway, okay, let's go back. Okay, after you made the change you want to make, you go here. Oops, sorry. Yeah, and it's going to be a specific extension, VE diagram, and you're going to make it diagram about blah 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 something. It's saved on your network, and anybody can find the same folder, open the diagram, and it's going to open in this particular editor, but it is not related to the code, and it's not related to your Visual Expert project. It's just another strategy to deploy your diagrams. Now, let me show you a couple additional features, and we'll be done for the examples. One interesting thing with the UI is that you have the possibility to, detach these views right here and put them side by side. So, for example, I could generate 2 diagrams with the same table. The first one is the one with the data model, the data dependencies between table, and the second one could be the one with the dependencies with the code. And what I can do is put them side by side. So I have the 2 views. Let me zoom out to make it a bit easier to visualize. I can, take this one, for example, and dock it in a different place, like on the right. So what do I get at the end? Actually, let me give a bit more space to the source code. That would allow me to see, my table under 2 different angles. Number one, what are the data dependencies for this particular table? And you can see that the source code is synchronized anytime I click on this. And number 2, for the same table, the code dependencies to see, where is this table used on the Powerbuilder side and on the database side. So if you're about to, maintain your application and rework this part where you are manipulating sales order, that might be useful to see, all the way that this particular table is used with data dependencies and code dependencies. You can even go side by side like this with different features. So you see, this is a diagram representation of the object calling this table. But with Visual Expert, you have different representations. So this is a tree view representation of the dependencies. And if I generate the diagram that we saw before, then I can have side by side 2 ways of visualizing the dependencies to this table. This diagram is useful if you have a small number of dependencies, but if the diagram becomes too big, then the tree view might be more solid, more robust to handle a large volume of dependencies. Okay, that's it for the few examples. Time is passing, so now let me go back here and let's quickly discuss about getting started with Visual Expert. So, how to get started? So there are basically 2 cases. Depending on the size of your application. So if you're having a small project or relatively small, that would be somewhere below 1,000 Powerbuilder or database object, then it's pretty straightforward. You will just take the setup and it will get you, every step of the way. You download and install Visual Expert. We will send to all the attendees this slideshow, and you will find the URL behind the slide. You can then select your code when prompted after installation, and Visual Expert will automatically analyze it. When you're done, you need to request a key to get the full result, because by default, if you don't have a product key, you will have limited result. But like I said, any attendee to the webcast are entitled to get a free key. So do not hesitate to request a key, whether it's for a standalone copy or a server installation with multiple users, that's fine. Just get a free copy to give it a try. You can also check out some guides to leverage more feature, or if you have question, you just post a ticket to the support team. So let me show you quickly how that works if you create a project. So you would go here, and after the installation, basically Visual Expert, depending on the version you download, will prompt you, where is your code? So if you're looking at adding Powerbuilder code, you would select a particular version of the code. You can select add a target or a workspace and point at your Powerbuilder code. You can also select code from folders and PBL files, or you can go to a Team Foundation server to retrieve targets or files and folders. For a database, it's a bit different. You can either find folder and files containing your code, the same with Team Foundation server, but you can also directly connect to the database. And once you enter your credentials like this, let me see if this is working. Okay, good. Then you can select the database in your server. This one, for example, that's the minimum you have to do, but I do recommend, if you have a large database, to filter the tables, procedures, and views that you want to analyze. Maybe you do not want to analyze everything. It's just going to be too big, too long, too heavy, too painful to browse, etc. So if that's the case, you have different ways of filtering. You can filter by DB owner and select a particular DB owner. Or if you click here, you have more options. You can select object by type, or you can combine type and name. So for example, I would select all the tables or procedures that start with a certain string, DBO something, for example. This step is optional, but it's very useful if you have a large project. Okay, so coming back here, this is the case of a small project. Like I said, install, and the wizard will take you, every step of the way. If you have a larger project, then you need to consider two questions. Is your machine, does your machine have enough resource to handle a large volume of code? And we have some requirement. And also, is your repository, that's the database containing the description of your code, is your Visual Expert repository capable of handling this large volume of code? Let me explain a bit further. First of all, of course, you will download install Visual Expert, and you will check behind this link the system requirement. If the default machine you're about to use, whether it's a local PC or a VM or a server, if your default machine does meet the minimum requirement, that's fine. You go ahead and you install Visual Expert on this machine. If not, then you have to choose another machine or upgrade your VM or select another server until you reach the minimum system requirement. That's for the machine hardware side. Then you would start analyzing your code. When prompted, you will select the code as we saw before, start the code analysis. And it's quite simple. Was it completed or not? If it's not completed, it means that the default repository you have and that was created automatically and silently by Visual Expert during the installation is not enough. Or if it did complete the code analysis, that's fine. You can go ahead. So if it could complete the code, you just request a key as we discussed. And by the way, the key is stored in the repository. That's why you want to request your key after the analysis is completed and after you check that the repository is solid enough to handle your analysis. You request your key and then you can check the guides or post ticket. If the analysis was not completed, it means that probably the default repository created by Visual Expert in a small local DB silently during the installation is not enough. In that case, you need to rely on an external database, and that has to be SQL Server. So behind these links, you have a procedure to either reuse an existing instance of Visual of SQL Server if you have one in your company, or to install SQL Server Developer Edition, which is free of charge, and that can be installed on your PC and that can handle a very large volume of code. Then you go ahead and, like we did before, you select your code, analyze the code, and once it's done, you request a key, again, free for the attendees, that will be stored in the repository. And then you check the guides and post a ticket if you have any question.